On today's show, we unfortunately have to say goodbye to the 2024 Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at JustBaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONMLB to win $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Well, the New York Mets season came up just a little bit short. We're all waking up today for the first time, not having another Mets game to look forward to. And it's not a good feeling. I did the live stream as soon as the game ended, right? When the final out came in, and did 40 minutes, took some questions from the fans, and then sat back and processed the whole thing and watched all the different interviews that the players had. And you see the sorrow on their faces, the appreciation for what they all just experienced, and the brotherhood that the 2024 Mets formed and the family that they were. And as a fan, you're not necessarily part of that, but you get a window into it every day, following this team and loving this team as much as all of us Mets fans do. And now, just like that, it ends. And all the hope and optimism that you still had as you woke up on Sunday morning, envisioning the Mets getting that victory in Game 6, pulling off the improbable comeback in Game 7 and winning the series from down 3-1 to getting to watch a Subway World Series, Mets-Yankees, and what that could have meant. And could this team really have, against all odds, won it all? And now we know, no, they're not going to. In a season where 30 teams began, the Mets finished third. They came up 2 wins short, and they lost to a Dodgers team that very well could win the World Series. And now you have to start to look ahead, and you have to start thinking about what's in store for the New York Mets. And we're going to do a lot of that on this show. The one thing I have to say is, luckily, Locked On Mets is not going anywhere. And I'm looking forward to the offseason now. As much as I am sad today that it's over, I now think about all the things we get to talk about. And there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of things the Mets had to build on here. But also, I want to take the moment today, and we'll probably do another show this week where I break down the best moments of this season. And we'll have a lot of that really still, but really taking the moment today to appreciate and thank the 2024 New York Mets for giving us so much joy over the past 5 months. A team that all of us were ready to give up on at the end of May, a team that some fans stopped watching. I'm sure a lot of fans stopped watching. I talked about it, throughout this run. I mean, I was doing a show where I had the cold open every day, where it was the Groundhog Day of misery for the New York Mets continues, because the Mets continue to find ways to lose in May. And that was compounded off of a 2023 that was a disaster. And you go back to the end of May, and the state of mind of this fan base on where this franchise was, where it did feel like the curse of the New York Mets was alive and well, even though they have the right owner, the right president. At the time, you might not have known they had the right manager, but still, you didn't have as much faith that this team would figure it out. And in 5 short months, but also 5 incredible months with so many amazing moments, this team completely changed their narrative. And I think it's so amazing that the core members of this team that have been there for so long have gotten a chance, or got the chance, to live out this incredible ride and to do it together, and to have moments across the board. All of them had their moments where they were able to realize their potential as New York Mets and get so very close. And it starts with Francisco Lindor. The season Lindor just had, it is one for the ages. I mean, that's the type of season that you look back at his career when it's all said and done. You say, man, 2024 Francisco Lindor was as good as anyone in the game. You know, you might look at Shohei Ohtani and Aaron Judge and the numbers that they have, and they're going to square off in the World Series, or Juan Soto or Mookie Betts or any of those guys, across the league. Bobby Witt Jr., Gunnar Henderson, all of the great players in baseball. And yeah, you could say Shohei Ohtani is a better hitter than Francisco Lindor, but I defy you to find a player that had a better complete season than Francisco Lindor. What he did as a leader in New York City, it was remarkable. And it was the culmination of 4 years of this Hall of Fame talent figuring it out under the pressure of a massive contract and what it means to fulfill the responsibility of that deal. When Francisco Lindor got the $341 million, to make sure he got that $1 million more than Fernando Tatis, so that he got the contract he deserved as the best shortstop in the game. There was immense pressure put on him, and he has felt that from this fan base for years. And to see him finally win over the fan base at large, to see him put together this season, what he did from being a leader and holding himself and his team accountable at the end of May, to his play on the field sparking this run, to all the clutch hits, big home runs, big moments, to Game 5 of the NLCS at home, the Temptations playing My Girl, a tribute to Francisco Lindor's daughters, and the walk-up song that has become one of the rallying cries for this team, and a moment that Mets fans share at every home game at Citi Field when Francisco Lindor steps into the box. That is so awesome. And we're not going to forget this season for Francisco Lindor moving forward. He is the face of the franchise that you trust to get the Mets to the promised land. If there's going to be a guy that's going to get the Mets their first World Series title since 1986, it is Francisco Lindor. And then you move beyond him. You look at Brandon Nimmo, the longest tenured member of the New York Mets, drafted at 18 years old back in 2011. 13 years later, he gets to celebrate with his teammates at Citi Field as they beat the Phillies and they made it to the NLCS. And we learn that Nimmo played through plantar fasciitis, which is a really tough injury that was probably killing him all season long. It got, to the point where it really got aggravated and it was worse down the stretch of the playoffs. But I promise he was feeling that all year long. And Nimmo didn't have his best season in a Mets uniform, but it was still very good. He drove in more runs than he ever has. He continued to progress as a leader. And I'm so happy for him that he got to have this experience. And moving forward, you have Lindor and Nimmo as the two highest paid leaders of this team locked up. And you feel really good about the fact that those guys are the pillars of this franchise when it comes to the players in that clubhouse. So awesome for him. And then it's Pete Alonso. And Pete Alonso brings some extra weight to his name right now because of his impending free agency. And it's a story that we can't ignore. And trust me, as we transition to the offseason, he is going to be front and center of what we're talking about on this show. Pete Alonso had a year where Mets fans grew tired of the situation, of the impending free agency, of him not having the best season compared to years past, of him getting the opportunity to be in the All-Star game more due to his own fanfare that he brings to the home run derby rather than some more deserving Mets or other players in the league. And we talked about that, and it put us as a fan base in a weird position with Pete Alonso. And with a couple mighty swings of the bat in October, he erased all of that. And he made it very hard to say goodbye if that was the last game that Pete Alonso will play in a Mets uniform. Then you talk about Edwin Diaz, who missed all of last season due to a freak injury. And did he have a lot of downs this year along with his ups? Absolutely. But in Game 6 of the NLCS, who was the best pitcher on the New York Mets? It was Edwin Diaz. And he got a lot of big outs along the way. He got the outs the Mets needed to clinch a playoff berth against the Braves after blowing the lead in the 8th inning. He was able to settle back in and get the job done. And he got a lot of big outs throughout the playoffs. Talk about Starling Marte. who was one of the biggest free agents the Mets have signed in the Steve Cohen era. It was Max Scherzer was the huge name, but Starling Marte was right there with him. That free agent period going into the 2022 season. And he was an all-star in 2022, a huge part of a team that won 101 games. And then 2023, coming off double groin surgery, it was a disaster. That contract looked like an absolute albatross. How could the Mets even afford to play Starling Marte anymore? Should they eat the deal? Well, in the biggest moments in October, Starling Marte grabbed his starting right fielder job back because that was even in doubt. Who was going to start in right? Was it going to be Jesse Winker or Starling Marte? Starling Marte grabbed his everyday role again and had so many huge moments in the playoffs. Considering what he did in 2022 and what he did in 2024, regardless of what he does in the final year of his deal in 2025, Starling Marte's contract was money well spent. Along the same lines, Jose Quintana signs a 2-year deal, misses the first half of that first year in 2023. Big reason why the Mets didn't have the success that they could have that season was because Quintana had another kind of freak injury, a rib injury. This year, he was pivotal to the New York Mets. He was the steady force, the opening day starter, the guy that was on the mound for their clincher in the wild card round and in the NLDS. Huge season from Jose Quintana. And then you talk about some young homegrown players. David Peterson, huge breakout season for him. Big moments in October, but also just a fantastic season where he finally established himself as a no doubt about it starting pitcher in the Mets rotation next year. There's not a question. David Peterson is not on that bubble where he is the sixth in line on the depth chart and something has to happen to open the door for him to get a spot in the rotation. He's there. He's locked in. He is part of this team in the future, and he will be a big, big part of that rotation in 2025. And then the biggest breakout story of them all, Mark Vientos, sets a franchise record for the most RBIs ever in a single postseason for the New York Mets. More than Daniel Murphy in 2015, more than Mike Piazza in 1999, 2000, John Olerud, who did have the record along with Curtis Granderson. People don't remember how good of a playoff run Granderson had in 2015. It's because Daniel Murphy sort of went away in the World Series. Granderson did not. But Mark Vientos surpasses all of them. Unbelievable season, even better postseason. And Mark Vientos goes from the guy that could never find a spot, the guy that wasn't on the opening day roster, to a core member of this team. What the Mets did this season was unbelievable. And there's so many faces that came into the fold this year that are part of what got them to this point. And unfortunately, the saddest part about a season ending, particularly one that was as special as this one, is as all those players did when the media was going around talking to them after the game, that for a good amount of them, this was goodbye. And so that's what we're going to talk about next here. Who's coming back? Who's on their way out the door? Who are the impending free agents? We're going to start to look ahead because unfortunately, this group that was so special, while some of them will return, not all of them will. So we're going to go through that in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app. With over 5 million active members, Prize Picks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Unlike other apps on Prize Picks, it's just you against the numbers. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections. You watch the winnings roll in. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become part of the Prize Picks community today, where you can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. You can cook up hot takes with your friends and win real money this football season when you and your crew run your game on Prize Picks. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the code LOCKEDONMLB. You're going to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5. That's code LOCKEDONMLB on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive that $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Prize Picks, run your game. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Now, this was year one of the David Stearns era for the New York Mets. And for those of you who have listened to this show for years now, you might know that I've had my eye on David Stearns long before he took the job for the New York Mets. I remember last year after the trade deadline, I wrote an article and it was about 5 things the Mets had to do to become contenders in 2025. And number one on that list was hire David Stearns. And it happened before the season was over. And as much as you can credit, and you should credit, all the players in that clubhouse, the guys that we just talked about who have been here for a while and had great seasons, as much as you can credit Steve Cohen for the organization that he has put in place, all the different things that he has done since he has took over this team to make the Mets a world-class organization, and even Carlos Mendoza for his work leading this team in that clubhouse, a fantastic rookie manager. David Stearns deserves so much credit for what this season turned into, because another GM might have taken this job with the 5-year deal in place, having the keys to the franchise, and they might have taken a step back. They might have tried to set themselves up for a decade. They might have said, you know what? Pete Alonso's an impending free agent. I don't want to sign him. I don't think he's going to come back. So let's shop him in the offseason and see if we can get some prospects. Let's try to trade Jose Quintana. Why keep him? We're not going to be competitive this year. Let's trade him. Let's move on from everybody that we can and focus solely on building out our franchise moving forward. And just think about 2025. Let's make sure that Mark Vientos and Brett Beatty are playing every single day this season. Yeah, JD Martinez has fallen into our laps at the end of spring training. We don't want that. It's fine. We're going to roll with Vientos. And the funny thing is, in some respects, that might have been the right decision to have Vientos be on the roster every day, as we've learned. But you had to find out about Brett Beatty too. And so every step of the way, David Stearns did an incredible job walking the tightrope of wanting to make sure you don't rob the 2025 core for a 2024 season that was always a long shot to end up where it did, but to continue to put your best foot forward to win now. And anybody who calls him mini market Stearns, you could not be more wrong. Just because he thrived in a small market in Milwaukee does not mean he will operate that way. And you might think because he didn't go out and he didn't spend money like crazy his first offseason, signing a bunch of bad long-term contracts, that he wasn't invested in being the GM that a Steve Cohen can support, like Billy Epler, who was able to just spend. And Billy Epler deserves some credit because he did a lot of good things with the Mets still. But David Stearns knew the position the Mets were in, and he targeted high upside guys on short-term deals that were either going to flourish and help this team contend, flourish and be huge trade assets at the deadline, or it wasn't going to work out and they were going to be off the books. And you look at the offseason that he had in retrospect, to have nabbed Sean Manaea and Luis Severino and got 360 innings out of them, which the training staff deserves some credit there too, but to have landed those two pitchers, to see that work out as well as it did, to prioritize defense, bring in Harrison Bader and Tyrone Taylor, to sign JD Martinez, to sign a million different relievers to see what stuck on minor league deals, and then to get a bunch of other veterans to Syracuse to be able to supplement the big league roster throughout the season, the biggest of which was Jose Iglesias, who was such a remarkable find for this organization. Then you talk about the deadline, right? You're in it, but the Mets still made the playoffs via a tiebreaker. It could have gone the other way. So had the Mets been more aggressive at the deadline, and if it didn't work, you would have regretted it. The Mets still made moves, though. And you might think, well, man, what if they had one more pitcher? You can woulda, coulda, shoulda all you want. And yes, on with hindsight, being in game six of the NLCS, would have been great if the Mets had traded for Jack Flaherty and he was on the Mets side instead of the Dodgers side, or if they would have gotten whatever big reliever, Tanner Scott. But the Mets had to make sure they got there, and they couldn't give up too many resources to get there. But you look at the fact that he got Phil Maton, Ryan Stanek, and Jesse Winker at the deadline, and the performances those guys had in October, particularly Stanek and Winker. That's an incredible deadline even. So David Stearns deserves a lot of credit. Now, as we look forward, a lot of those guys he brought in become free agents off of good years, which means they can cash in with other teams. Francisco Lindor said it best to the media. He said, those guys, did a great job for their agents. They made themselves a lot of money. And he sort of talked about the reality of the fact that some of these guys are going to walk out the door. So you look at the list, right? Pete Alonso, we will have plenty of time to discuss him. Sean Manaea, Luis Severino, Jose Quintana, your starting rotation that got you to this point, all of them become free agents. Now, I think, and we will do a whole episode on it, Manaea and Severino should be extended qualifying offers. We'll talk about that at a later date, about what that means and why the Mets should do that. Jose Quintana is a veteran that you should absolutely explore signing this offseason. Are the Mets going to prioritize him over other free agents? We don't know. I trust the front office to make that distinction, to make that decision. But we'll see. Those guys all could be out the door, though. You look at the position players, Harrison Bader, JD Martinez, Jose Iglesias, Jesse Winker. All those guys become free agents. Now, I think Iglesias stands the best chance to come back because of what he means to the team. Because as much as he had a great year, I don't think that he's got a starting job guaranteed in free agency from anybody. And so I can see the Mets being able to sign him at a fairly reasonable number. Maybe he does get a 2-year deal. Maybe that's the difference. But I feel like Iglesias is the most likely to be back of that group. We'll see with the other three. I would love to see Jesse Winker back. I was dead wrong about him. I did not like the trade as soon as it happened. Before the trade happened, he was not a guy I had circled that I wanted the Mets to go after. He was sensational, particularly in the playoffs. So could the Mets sign Jesse Winker to be part of the team next year? Absolutely. Will they? I don't know, because he might get more money and more opportunity from another team. Same thing can be said about Harrison Bader to some respects, although he obviously faded down the stretch. Kind of feel like Tyrone Taylor being in place, you would think Bader's going to go elsewhere, and I think JD Martinez will probably end up on another team as well. Then you talk about the money coming off the books as we start to think about free agency, and it's just worth noting the other players that are leaving the Mets payroll that had no role in this run whatsoever outside of Scherzer netting the Mets, Luis Acuna, who had an unbelievable week where the Mets went 6-1 with him as their starting shortstop while Lindor was dealing with that back injury. Huge credit to Scherzer for that one. You have $55 million coming off your 2024 books in Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander. And the fact that Justin Verlander was not able to stay on the mound this year is a huge benefit to the New York Mets, because otherwise the Astros would have gladly picked up his $35 million club option. The Mets would have had to pay half of that next year. Now that's $17.5 million you have to spend elsewhere. That is a big development for this franchise. James McCann and Omar Narvaez accounted for $15 million on the Mets payroll. So as much as Fox wants to throw out there, the three highest paid, the three teams with the highest payrolls in the championship series round with the Dodgers, the Yankees, and the Mets. There is right there $70 million on the Mets payroll that was not active. And the list goes on beyond that. Guys like Adrian Hauser, $5 million, Joey Wendell, and others. So a lot of money comes off the books. So once we get into the meat of our offseason discussion, where we're talking about the likes of Juan Soto, Corbin Burns, of course, Pete Alonso, and others, the Mets will have a lot of money to play with this offseason. And they have the right guy in David Stearns to identify the talents that they should be investing in, the guys that deserve the multi-year commitments, and finding more diamonds in the rough like he did with Manaea, Severino, and of course, others like the real diamonds in the rough that were so far buried you couldn't see it, like a Jose Iglesias. So with Stearns in place here going into year 2, after going through his first full cycle in a baseball season, which he talked about how he wasn't going to feel completely comfortable about the ins and outs of the organization until you go through one full cycle. Well, that cycle went longer than anyone could have expected, and he is very ready to take this team to the next level in 2025. The question is, who is part of the core going into that season? That's where we're going to close out the show today. First, though, another quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So you can get the hunch in the middle of the game. You can check out the latest stats, be live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you're going to get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. So $200 bonus bets guaranteed. All you got to do is sign up, place that first $5 bet. Maybe that's on Monday Night Football. Maybe you're looking at the World Series. You might have a favorite who you think is going to win between the Yankees or the Dodgers. Throw that $5 bet on there, and you're going to be rewarded with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed, win or lose. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. I will be giving out a lot of thank yous to close out the show today, and I wanted to take the time here to thank the most loyal listeners of this show, the Locked On Mets insiders, who have been part of our texting service all year long. I've had so much fun getting to know some of you on a more personal level, hearing your stories, and just knowing how much you guys tune into the show and follow along every day. I appreciate you all so much. If you want to be part of the Locked On Mets insider community, find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. All right, so the core moving forward. This is going to be a little bit of a longer show today, but hey, we're closing the books on 2024, so it is well-deserved. I would say, as you think about the future, here's the first thing that comes to mind for me. The New York Mets have 4 pillars of their organization that are in place that make me feel incredible about the run this franchise can go on over the next 3 to 5 years at least. You got the best owner in the sport in Steve Cohen. No one invests more in his team or cares more about his team than Steve Cohen does, and that's all you want in an owner. So that is huge. I will give a personal thank you right now to Steve Cohen because the first, I guess, year and a half, 2 years covering Locked On Mets, 2019, 2020, a lot of my show was just expressing frustrations about the Wilpons. And Steve Cohen gave me the best birthday gift I think I've ever received. September 14, 2020, my 25th birthday, when he purchased the New York Mets, or when that news first came out. Obviously, it took some time for it to be official, but I don't think I would be in the position I'm in at my personal life, literally, if not for Steve Cohen purchasing the Mets and what that's meant for this franchise and what it's meant for the fanfare around this franchise and by extension this show. So thank you to Steve Cohen. And getting back to the pillars of this organization, Cohen being in place has always promised a brighter future for the Mets. But getting the executive under him that could run the show, that could handle the pressure of managing this team in this market and could use all of the resources that Cohen had to offer properly, that took some time. And now David Stearns is in place, and they found the right manager in Carlos Mendoza. And even further, Francisco Lindor has been here and clearly has been a good enough, if not great enough, the better way to describe it, franchise player. But this was the year that it all came together as a leader, as the captain of this team moving forward. Having owner to president to manager to best player all in place. How many teams in Major League Baseball can say that? So that's the first thing. Now, when you focus more on the roster, core members of this team, the New York Mets are building around a core of Francisco Lindor, Brandon Nimmo, Mark Vientos, and Francisco Alvarez. Long-term, those are your foundational pieces. Lindor and Nimmo on the big contracts, Vientos and Alvarez, the homegrown players who will be starting for this team for years to come. Look at the pitching side of things. Kodai Senga had a rough year with injuries and obviously didn't look great in the playoffs, but you have to give him some time here to rest and recover this offseason and start again next year. Kodai Senga was brilliant as a rookie, and one benefit of this bad season is there was an opt-out in Kodai Senga's contract that he will no longer be able to exercise. So that means he is under team control for the next 3 years at $15 million per season. That is a steal of a deal for an ace-level pitcher, and I expect him to return to that form next year. You have David Peterson, who I already talked about, clearly going to be a fixture of this rotation moving forward. His free agency is approaching faster than you think. We'll get it another time. I think it's 2 or 3 years left for David Peterson, but he's definitely locked in next season and a guy to build around. He might be an extension candidate. We'll talk about that at a later date. And then you have Edwin Diaz, who has 3 more years of club control with an option as well for a 4th year. So those are the foundational pieces that you're going to move everything else around and build everything else around. And looking more specifically at 2025, you're still probably going to have Jeff McNeil. He's under contract for some time. We'll see what happens there. You're going to have Luis Torrens as Alvarez's backup catcher, I'm guessing. So they're not going to have to worry about catching this offseason. And then when you talk about the prospects, there's going to be an influx of talent next year from a youth movement. We saw Acuna at the end of the season. Brett Beatty's going to get another crack at it in some capacity. Ronnie Mauricio will be healthy. Jet Williams could make his return, could make his debut next season. And that's going to be so many different infielders vying for playing time that if the Mets were to just re-sign Jose Iglesias and potentially Pete Alonso, there's no other needs in the infield. And they could let Alonso and Iglesias walk and not address this infield whatsoever and just trust the youth, and I think they'd be fine. So the infield is in great shape. The outfield might need a little more work. You got Nimmo in place. You got Marte, although I think you've learned through the last couple of years that you might as well have a good contingency plan in place just in case Marte can't be healthy the whole season. But if you get him healthy in October, he could do big things for you, and Tyrone Taylor will be back. Beyond that, Drew Gilbert has a chance to debut next season. Acuna could play the outfield, as could Jet Williams. And obviously, Jeff McNeil can always move out there as well, depending on the state of your infield. Already talked about the core pitchers, but just to give you a little taste of what the Mets already have in place for their starting rotation, unfortunately, Christian Scott will not be part of the rotation next year after undergoing Tommy John surgery, but you still have Kodai Senga, you have David Peterson, you have Tyler McGill, you have Paul Blackburn, he'll be back. You have Jose Buda, who could factor into the rotation instead of the bullpen, and you have prospects coming in Brandon Sproat, your top pitching prospect, who should be up next year, and then other guys that are depth in the organization like Blade Tidwell, Mike Vassell, Tom Hamill, and others. You go to the bullpen. Edwin Diaz, obviously locked in. That's who you build around. But you had great stories this year in Daniel Nunez and Reed Garrett. Those guys will be back and will not be making much money. You still have Sean Reed Foley if you want to keep him. Huascar Brazaban should be back, and Danny Young, amongst others. Phil Maton has a $7.75 million club option. That'll be one decision the Mets have to make. There is a lot in place here, even though there's a lot that's leaving in free agency. And so what the next couple months of this show are is we get to act like we're GMs on this show, or I get to act like a GM and run you through all the different scenarios that the front office will be kicking around. We'll be talking about those impending free agents first and foremost as we get into offseason coverage. So that's what you had to look forward to on this show. We'll be talking about Pete Alonso's free agency. What will happen with those starting pitchers? Will the veterans be back like JD Martinez, Jose Iglesias, Jesse Winker, and others? So there's a lot that we have to talk about in this show, just because this is sort of last day of school vibes when you're listening to this episode. The reality of the baseball calendars, it never stops, particularly with Locked On Mets. I don't go anywhere. I do 5 days a week all year long. So make sure you continue to tune into the show, which leads me to having to end this show today. And this is the sappy part where I thank you all for tuning in. On May 12th, that was actually the last day off I had with this podcast. And we're not going to get one until Saturday. So Friday night, October 25th, happy birthday, Juan Soto. That'll be game 1 of the World Series. That'll be the first time that I do not close my night by doing an episode of Locked On Mets. And it's going to be a somber night for me, I think. I get to sort of delay that a little bit with this being the start of a week, and I'll be giving you shows throughout. But you go back now, it's 161 consecutive days of doing Locked On Mets. And I've done 5 days a week all the way back to March of 2019. And did 5 days a week at times through, COVID and the pandemic, which was really tough and was an interesting challenge that taught me that there's always something to talk about with the New York Mets. But this year was the first time I did 7 days a week because Locked On typically asks our host to do Monday through Friday because that's a big commitment in of itself, and people have lives and want to enjoy their weekends. But I have always felt a pull to do weekend shows because Friday night baseball can sometimes be the best game you get all week. And the same thing can be said about Saturday night. And so it was the middle of May when the Mets were going through their darkest times, and there was a collapse to talk about seemingly every night. And I wanted to talk about those collapses. And so I just started doing shows every single day. And then as the ball started rolling on that and the Mets started to go on their run in June, it became a point of pride of I'm not going to stop. I'm going to do 7 days a week. And it was mostly just easy because I love doing this show. But there were times where I was traveling and I'm in California with my wife and my sister and my brother-in-law. We're having this vacation and we spend one day we spent 8 o'clock in the morning to midnight in Disneyland. And then I came home and had to do a show and I'm falling asleep doing it. And there was times where it wasn't easy, but I always came back to the everyday listener that got into the routine of starting their day with this show. And I always wanted to have that show there for you. So that was the way I showed gratitude all year. And I really am so thankful that I get to do this as a career between Locked On and Just Baseball. I have the most amazing set of jobs that anyone could ask for. The hours I put in don't always feel like it because I sincerely love what I do every day. And the listener is the reason I'm allowed to do those things. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to the Locked On Podcast Network for allowing me to have this seat hosting this show since 2019. I always like to thank David Locke at times like this. He obviously is the founder of our network, and he took a shot on me when I was just a senior in college who had, some podcasting experience because I did a show with my uncle, but nothing that was ever major. And I was just a multimedia journalism student that was graduating in a couple months. And he saw the passion I had for the Mets and he gave me a shot. And here I am now. So thank you, David. Thank you to Just Baseball and the work we do over there, because that helps me continue to do this and focus so much on baseball. So I love all the coworkers I have over there and all the people that work for me on my writing staff as the managing editor. And finally, as we bid end to the 2024 season and look ahead to 2025, the last thank you is always reserved to my dad for making me a crazy Mets fan before I knew any better. The conversations that we had growing up about the Mets, how our daily communication always revolved around the New York Mets, has turned into what I do for a living. And that is the biggest blessing. That's why no matter where I move this show, I moved apartments a couple weeks back or about a month ago now. And that poster behind my shoulder that my dad bought me, I think it was a graduation present, that Mets thing that I got back there, it'll always be behind me because he is always the one that is behind me that put me, in this position, that taught me everything, what it means to be a man and everything else in my life. So Dad, thank you for everything. I'm so happy we got to share so many memories together for this 2024 season. And the fact that it all started June 3rd on your birthday, it just made it a really special season. So with that will be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you all for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on X, Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find a link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listener, your first watch every day. After your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel that covers everything in the world of sports. Talking about Locked On Sports Today, our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports Today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.